Welcome to the Winning Endgame Strategies course. My name is Davorin Kuljasevic. I'm a Grandmaster from Croatia. And as you can tell from the name of the course, we will take a look at different endgame strategies that are important for any practical chess player, because a lot of times in our games it so happens that we reach an endgame where it's important to know how to proceed. So when you have a good position, to convert your advantage, or if you have a bad position, just to maybe save the game. But our focus in this video series will be on such positions where one side has advantage, and we will look at different strategies to increase this advantage and to get the winning position. So this is, as I said, a practically very important part of the game, because game is often decided in the end game. Of course, some games are decided early in the middle game, but if the game was kind of balanced and your opponent was defending well, then you might reach some endgame with an extra pawn or with some positional advantage. And in such cases, it is very important to know the right strategies, how to proceed. I don't have to tell you that I've met a lot of people, and I had some students who struggle in this part of the game. Some of them even just said, I'm bad at endgames, just like that, which might have been true at that point, but it's not as simple as that. You can't just say I'm bad at something. You probably are just lacking either experience, or you haven't practiced enough, because endgames, they're not simple, of course. There are many different parts to it, and if you are struggling in this part of the game, you probably don't know certain strategies that are needed. And this is exactly what this course is about. So this is one reason why endgame technique is very important, because the game is very often decided here. And the second reason is because this day and age, endgames are often played with little time on the clock. Maybe some 30-40 years ago it was not like that. Actually, they had these adjournments and people could analyze the endgames, think about them. But these days you just don't have time at all. Maybe you're playing on the increment in a lot of these endgames. So it's essential to have these techniques, the proper strategies, ready beforehand. So when you already reach, let's say, a winning endgame position, that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you already know what's the right strategy to win this endgame, for example. And also you have probably noticed that virtually all top players, either in the past or contemporary ones, are excellent endgame players. Maybe I would say just one exception recently was Topalov. Okay, it was clear that in some games he showed less or worse endgame technique than, let's say, Kramnik when they played the match. But then he did the right work, and he improved his endgame significantly. And we will see one or two examples where he showed the brilliant endgame technique. We'll see this in this course. So if you can master this quite well, the endgame technique, you might even get a competitive edge over your opponents. So something that has been your weakness before, well, it's probably a weakness for other people too. So if you do the work, then this can give you, as I said, the competitive advantage against other people. So the goals of this course will be first to give you a wide variety of these concrete endgame tools and techniques, and we will talk about them shortly. And the second is to simply improve your endgame intuition by looking at so many examples. We will see about 50 instructive examples of top players, how they use these strategies, and I think just by looking at them, going through them, it gives you a good feel about the endgame in general. One thing I want to say before we move on to concrete examples is what inspired me actually to do this course. It is a book by a Russian author. I'm not sure how famous this is, but let's say that it's kind of well known in Grandmaster circles. It's a book by Mikhail Shereshevsky called Endgame Strategy. And that's a book I got when I was maybe 15 years old or something like that. I was 2300 rated player, maybe even a little bit less. After I read the book, and mind you, cover to cover, by analyzing every single example, I believe I reached the international master strength. So that's within like 4 or 5 months. Just by going through this book. It's an excellent book. It gives a lot of principles that we will also talk about here. It's really something that I thought was missing from my chess education at that time. And that's what I would strongly recommend to you, to get the book if you can. I believe it's been translated to English. And to go through the examples in the book if you really want to improve your endgame technique. So there, Shereshevsky, the author, he talks about some strategies that we will also cover here. So schematic thinking, the principle of two weaknesses, the problem of exchanging pieces, the do not hurry principle, king centralization, and many more. So this was kind of an inspiration for me, this book, and I wanted to add something new to the topic. So I found some good contemporary examples that could fit well into the themes that he was talking about. So what I want to say before we look at the examples is also that people, especially on the lower level, they're not exactly sure what to do in the endgame. And I want to share my philosophy. I believe this is a very objective kind of philosophy of the endgame. This is the way I see the endgame. So in the middle game, we have a lot of pieces, and also in the opening, and the goal of the game is to checkmate the king, right? This is the goal of chess. So when you have so many pieces on the board, especially queens, you can do it, right? You can checkmate your opponent either in the opening, like the Scholar's Mate, or in the middle game if you do some really nice attack, and he doesn't have any defense. But how often do you see a checkmate in the endgame? For example, the game that we have right here on the board, this will not happen. Neither white or black will checkmate unless somebody really wants to get checkmate. So how do you win then, if the goal is to checkmate? Well, you need to get a new queen, the way I see it, right? And then you will be able to checkmate. And this is why in the endgames the role of pawns increases, because every passed pawn is potentially a new queen. And here in this position, white has this kind of advantage that he has 3 potentially new queens. So, okay, this is just one example, but let's imagine that we have an endgame where there are no passed pawns. There are a lot of these. What do you do then? What's your strategy then? Well, then you need to create a passed pawn if you want to win. How do you create one if there is no passed pawn? Well, you have to, either your opponent will have a weakness or you have to create one. And to create a weakness, okay, maybe you have to do some maneuvering or some exchanging, but basically at some point your opponent will have a weak pawn, like the one on a7 right now. And maybe your opponent will be in time to defend this pawn. Okay, he will put a lot of forces in its defense. What do you do then? Well, then there is one topic that we will talk about here as well. It's the second weakness. You have to create the second weakness for your opponent, or if you can, the third weakness. And the more weaknesses your opponent has, the easier for you it will be to take advantage of them and eventually just to win one of these pawns, let's say. And when you win one of these pawns, then you have a passed pawn and so on. But it's not as simple as that. Of course, you have to use some techniques like schematic thinking, you know, where to put your pieces, what are the best squares for your pieces. You have to activate your pieces, and at the same time, you have to make sure that your opponent, the defender, doesn't have counterplay. This is crucial in endgames that you are trying to win. You should limit your opponent's counterplay. And we will also see how strong players do that. They're excellent at doing that. So this is just the general philosophy of the endgame. Okay, if you don't have some general direction, this is a good one. Think about these passed pawns, how to create them if they're not on the board, and then you have to do some specific strategies, specific maneuvering that we will talk about. And that should be the right path. So I think that's enough for the philosophy. Now let's look at some real examples. This one is from the game Gufeld, Edward Gufeld against Vasily Smyslov from 1975. Both players are Grandmasters. And Gufeld here with white, as we said, has the advantage, of course, because even though he doesn't have a piece, he has 3 potentially new queens. And he played the right move, a5, to start with. He just wants to push b6 and b7 and promote. You should also notice that the knights are very far away, so it's not so easy for black to catch these pawns. Now, a logical question is, why didn't Gufeld take the pawn on a7? After all, this is now a free pawn and b6 is still a threat. Well, this comes to this notion of not allowing counterplay to your opponent. What was the rook doing on e7? It was stopping the move knight e4. And now, after we have allowed knight e4, the knight is just in time to block the c-pawn and also put pressure on the other pawns. And this most likely will lead to a draw. So this is why Gufeld kept his rook on e7 and played a5. Now Smyslov had a difficult choice to either bring his rook or knight to f4. He played rook f4, but if the knight comes to f4, let's look at this. So white would of course push the pawn, and now the rook comes like this to h8. Here white has a really nice deflection idea, rook h7, after which when the rook moves he can promote and he will have extra material. So this was not a good line for black, and Smyslov played a better move, rook f4. Okay, not only attacking the pawn on c4, but also preparing knight e4 check. And Gufeld played c5, allowing knight e4 check. Was that a blunder? No, look at this move. Rook takes, and b6. So white is down a rook, but he's trusting his pawns so much that he says, I don't need the rook. Because all black pieces are very far away from the promotion square b8. And here, Smyslov didn't... he played the best move. He didn't lose his calm. Because if he took here, it would be immediately lost. His pieces cannot fight against both passed pawns. So this would be the winning variation. Both passed pawns are going, so you can choose a8 or b8. So Smyslov played rook e8. And now, knight takes a7. Very curious position, 3 passed pawns. And black has a choice whether to stop them with his king or with his knight. Let's see what happens if king goes to the queen side. So we push, and what now? a6, knight b5, a7 is threatened, king c6. Now we cannot play a7 because king takes b7, but we protect the pawn first. And this is a really interesting position because black king cannot attack the a pawn at all, so probably there is no way to stop a7. Well, there is one move, rook d8. Now a7, rook takes d6. So king c2 is the right move. And on the next move, simply a7. It's really funny how black pieces are close, but not close enough. They cannot stop the pawns. And this was the first variation that probably white player Gufeld saw when he sacrificed the rook. And instead of this, Smyslov didn't go king e6, he went knight e3. Okay, he wants to play knight c4, win the a pawn, so a6. Check. And knight comes to e5. But again, we just push the pawn. The rook is helpless, so he brings the king. But now c6. And after king d5, c7, Smyslov resigned. The other variation here was king d6. But then there would be check, interfering with the rook, so he cannot take the pawn. He has to play king c7, and then the a pawn decides the issue. So this example, I think it's very good to show the role of the pawns in the endgame. You can a lot of times sacrifice a piece if you have several two or more passed pawns, connected passed pawns. Because, as I said, the goal in the endgame is not to win material, like a lot of young people think, but it's to promote the pawn and get a new queen, so that you can checkmate your opponent. Okay, let's see another example. This time, I want to show another principle in the endgame, which is the role of the king. The king has to be active. That's different, of course, from the middle game, where we have to protect our king. In the endgame, our king can become a very active piece, indeed. And this is, I believe, a perfect example. I was kind of lucky that it happened in my own practice. So here, black is, of course, a pawn up. And the question is how to convert this advantage. Well, I know a lot of people here would play d4, so that if the bishop takes rook d8, we're playing for a small tactic. But if the bishop doesn't take, if it moves to d2 or something, okay, then d4 is of course a good move, but nothing decisive yet. Well, we could play this move, but also we could think about this principle of activating the king first. And here I just decided to bring my king to f5, to start with that, and then we will see what to do. Maybe I will push d4, maybe I will find some other ideas later. But it's definitely useful. Now, I think it would be really funny to hear that black has won this game in the next 10 moves. I think 8 of which were played by the king and 2 by the pawns. So black did not play with his knight or rook at all. He just played with the king and pawns, and he got a completely winning position. I know this is difficult to imagine from here, so let's see how it happened. White played like this, stopping king f5, but he missed a small tactical detail. Check. And now if he captures, his king will get checkmated. So this means that after h5, the king has to retreat. And now the king reaches f5. Now actually, with this move, black is threatening to play d4, and then bring his king to e5 and d5 and c4. This is the plan. For instance, king f2. We said that this cannot be taken, of course, because of rook d8. It's not difficult to see that the pawn endgame is completely lost. So bishop has to go to d2, and now king goes to c4. Very active king. So I don't even need my rook or knight. I can simply do a lot of damage with my king. Okay, white played this move. That's not very good, but either way d4 was coming. And now king goes to e5 and d5. And here white played another not so good move, f4, allowing the king to e4. Now the king is very, very active. It's threatening d3 and knight d4. So white played this move, trying to go rook e1. And now I suppose you can guess the move, because I said the next 8 moves will be made by the king. It is king d3. Attacking with the tempo. And the next move, king c2. And the rook is almost trapped. Okay, it has only one, square rook a1. But the thing here is that if you look from the starting position, the king has made a fantastic journey from g8 all the way into the heart of this, into the heart of white's position. And now it's totally winning. Okay, now black is winning in 10 different ways probably. So it's not the topic of our course anymore. Okay, I can just show knight c7, trying to go to d5, opening the rook. And here white has resigned. But the decisive action here was done by the king. So that's another endgame principle that you should always have in mind. And in the third example I want to show in this video, we have a position from the game, Kramnik against Leko. It was played in 2001 in their match. It was not World Championship match, but a rapid match in Hungary. And here we will see a host of these little endgame techniques that we will actually cover in more detail in the upcoming videos. So Kramnik with white has a clear positional advantage. He has more active pieces. Black has weaknesses that are shown here. The pawns on d5, b6 and b7, and he has a bad bishop. This bishop has no future. So white to move, what would you do? Would you take the pawn on d5? Kramnik didn't, because if rook takes d5, suddenly look at black's pieces. They become very active, and suddenly white has a weakness, the pawn on d4. So that's a tempting move, but not a really good one. You don't want to allow as we said, you don't want to allow your opponent any unnecessary activity. No, Kramnik had a different approach to this endgame. He used schematic thinking. So let's quickly define schematic thinking. It's finding the best squares for your pieces as a part of a general plan. So White's general plan is to attack weaknesses, and when he plays bishop e2, as you can see, he wants to put his bishop on f3 and rook on b3. The rook on e5 is placed well, of course. Now, in case of bishop c6, the pawn on, bishop c6, yeah, the pawn on b6 falls. So Leko played bishop e6 so that he can protect the pawn on b6. And here Kramnik noticed another problem in black's position, that the bishop on e6 is actually quite vulnerable, and f4, f5 is a big threat. And after g6, he played this move to make a small tactical trick. Bishop takes g6 is a threat, so Leko decided to bring his bishop to c8 after all. Now, rook e7, activating pieces, very important principle in the endgame. So at the same time, he is also tying down his opponent's pieces to defense of his weaknesses. Now b7 is a big weakness as well. Here was actually probably the only moment in this endgame that Leko could really show some defense, and this was rook d7. Okay, this was probably the only way for him to fight for a draw, because if he is able to trade a pair of rooks, his chances to make a draw would increase, of course. But for some reason he forgot to do that, and he played king g7. And now after a very strong move by Kramnik, bishop b5, it's too late. He cannot trade any of the rooks anymore. And this is how Kramnik limited his counterplay. Okay, now rook comes to c7. We see that Kramnik is again looking for the best squares for his pieces. He's always doing that. He's always trying to improve his position of his pieces. Leko is basically forced to move his pieces around. Okay, Kramnik is doing the same probably to win some time. So he's just moving his rook back to d6 and d8. What to do now for white? Okay, both of his rooks and the bishop are placed almost perfectly. Don't forget, as we said, about one very important piece in the endgame from the previous example, the king. Okay, king joins the game now. That's another important endgame strategy. Okay, now he's expanding on the queen side. On the king side. So look at this. Black has a lot of weaknesses on the queen side, and he has a d5 pawn that is potentially weak. But he's trying to create another weakness by pushing the pawns on the king side. So it's this total chess by Kramnik. He's just improving all over the board. Okay, again he's limiting his opponent's possibilities with this move, f5. And again, not allowing counterplay, because two rooks are tying down the f8 rook to defense of the f7 pawn. Okay, so this is like complete domination, but still there is no decisive move here, right? It's a symmetrical pawn structure, there are no passed pawns. And what to do now? Well, Kramnik decides that his king will do the job. So the king becomes the most active piece on the board now. As we said, black can do nothing but king f6, king g7, or rook d8, rook d6. Okay, so Kramnik brings his king to the queen side, and now he finds another plan. So this is schematic thinking. I need my king where? On which square? I need my king actually, if you come back here, on c5. But the pawn on b6 is there, so what should I do? Well, he decides to push the pawn to a5, exchange these pawns, and now he has a free path to c5. He has the access to this square, and after that it's easy, because I have several motives. I can attack either the d5 pawn, or I can win the b7 pawn, even with the exchange sacrifice, because the a6 pawn will become very strong. As we said, the pawns in the endgame, you can sacrifice material if you are sure that they will promote. Well, what happened was simply bishop e2 and bishop f3, and here Leko finally resigned, because after bishop takes on d5, basically all other pawns will fall. So this is a really, really nice example of endgame strategy in action by one of the top endgame players of today, Vladimir Kramnik. And I encourage you to look at this endgame if you need to once more. And we will look at more examples like this in the upcoming videos. I would like to just give you a structure, so you know what will come in the next in the videos. So we will focus on more specific endgame strategies. In the first couple of videos, we will look at examples with schematic thinking. Then from video 5 to 7, we will look at the problem of exchanging pieces. So which pieces are good to exchange and which not. The third topic will be principle of two weaknesses. We will see them in videos 8 and 9. Then in videos 10 and 11 we will look at positional advantage in symmetrical positions. And then after that we'll look at advantage against the isolated pawn. That's a very common topic in endgames as well. And the last couple of themes will be clearing the way for the passed pawn. So in situations where there is a piece that blocks the passed pawn. And the last topic we'll have is converting the advantage in various different scenarios. We will see some really good examples there as well. So stay tuned. In the next video we will start with the schematic thinking.